Hello and welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, visions and philosophy define contemporary India. My guest today has won the Right Livelihood Award, to many the alternative Nobel Prize. She's an activist, an advocate, a philosopher in the areas of environment, sustainable development, gender, biodiversity, a whole gamut of issues which come under the larger umbrella of counter-development, perhaps. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Vandana Shiva. Welcome. What do we understand by counter-development? It almost sounds like a phrase that says counter to development.
Well, development actually is such a nice word that one shouldn't have to counter it in itself. Development was meant to be the biological phenomena of a seed going into a tree, of an embryo growing into a person, the internally organized evolution from within. And somewhere around 1948, it was redefined to be an externally coercively managed process.
Why 1948?
Well, 1948 is the time the big development aid money got organized into the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and Robert McNamara was the one who basically said the only way we can move this money is to recognize that there are certain parts of the world that are underdeveloped and the rest of us who are developed. And it was a very arbitrarily created category which defined other cultures as underdeveloped just because you were different. And this movement from development as a self-evolving spontaneous phenomena into an externally imposed economic phenomena has created a terrible violence that we see all around us in Narmada, in Orissa, the cyclone. I've worked with fishermen on that coast, and I've seen how the mangroves have disappeared. And I can tell you as a physicist, if you don't have a buffer, and you have those wind velocities of 260 kilometers, you're going to have the kind of devastation we're seeing.
You know, looking at those sort of 1948 institutions, do you suspect that the agenda has been somewhat distorted? Was there a conceptual problem at that time? Wasn't this a Western materialist sensibility responding to the notion of poverty in the so-called developing world, which might potentially, if they came out of this poverty, develop into markets for their own economies? But essentially, they were looking at it in very materialist terms. And isn't there a materialist argument too?
There definitely is, but I really feel that if it wasn't for the opportunity of getting $3 for every dollar you put into development, that just thinking of those people out there as backward and underdeveloped, that materialistic interpretation which measures development in indicators of how much plastic you consume and cement you consume and paper you waste, that by itself it wouldn't have created the kind of arrangements we see around us.
But it also measures, an important dimension of that is the measure of literacy, of housing, of drinking water, of sanitation, which no matter how philosophically we might look at models of development, are crucial, something that we feel that is a legitimate aspiration of the community.
Well, if you look at the literature of the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, water, housing, education didn't figure in the development enterprise. What figured in it was dams, fertilizers, pesticides, thermal power plants, steel plants. And it's only after those kinds of maldevelopment projects, as I call them, started to destroy the base through which people met, their needs for shelter, their need for water, that you then had the development enterprise expand to cover these areas of deprivation. I would differentiate between basic needs and the development enterprise in the way it has been arranged. Basic needs, of course, have always existed, will always exist. They've always been people who have been denied of the very basic needs. But the scale at which that denial has hit larger numbers, tribals might not have the fanciest houses, but they all had their thatch huts. They weren't homeless people. They've been made homeless by the development projects. They might not have had tapped water, but they all had a clean stream. Today, they don't have that clean stream. So development created environmental destruction and social devastation. And now the development programs of the current times are having to mop up the devastation they have caused. So we get World Bank now giving loans for education and health and everything else that wasn't a problem in the 40s.
Well, I'm not sure I agree that literacy and housing and inadequate nutrition weren't problems in the 40s. I think the question is that what is the paradigm of development that would address itself? I think the assumption of the capitalist, the Bretton Woods institutions model of development is that if there is development, as they define it, that basic needs are simultaneously met. That if there is more production, if there is more factories, there are more goods, there are more services, people will find jobs and they will be able to meet their basic needs. What is the model that you advocate for fulfilling these basic needs?
Well, given that in countries like India, the majority of people neither have full-time government jobs, nor do they have an enterprise in terms of being part of a market situation. Most of them meet their needs by being producers working very closely with natural wealth, with biodiversity, with the soil, with the water. They're fishermen, they're tribals, they're farmers. That's 80% of our population. And their basic needs deprivation starts when the resources through which they meet their needs start to be either devastated or taken away from them. So for me, it's a very simple sort of model that we have in a stable constellation, in a development that is sustainable. You basically should have a very resilient economy of nature, which is balanced ecosystems, supporting people's economies in all their plurality, and then contributing to some amount of market growth, etc., but within the limits of people's needs and within the limits of ecological sustainability. But the perverse indicators of development have in a way turned this pyramid upside down. So we have tremendous market expansion. In terms of financial indicators, we've never had more money than we have floating around the world. In fact, there's so much, it's 3 times more than the goods on the planet, because so much of it is fictitious speculation. We have deprivation of the very basic levels because the resources through which people met their needs aren't available to them anymore. And of course, you've had the devastation of ecosystems, so that nature's capacity to recycle, to rejuvenate is also being eroded. Sustainable development, in my view, is putting the proportion back into nature's economy, people's economy, and the market economy.
But isn't this ultimately a manifestation of something very fundamental, human nature, that those of us who can and are in positions to consume more have a natural impulse, inclination to do so? At least that is the assumption of capitalism, and that we will be driven to growth through that assumption. How do you go around working with human nature?
Well, I think there is nothing like human nature without a culture in which it expresses itself. Humans are never bereft of a culture. And it depends on what cultural context human nature expresses itself.
But we tend to shed our cultural context so quickly. Whenever sort of development through television or the aspirations of development become accessible or available to communities, we seem to so rapidly shed them.
We seem to do it rapidly in a very narrow time context, but when you think of this civilization in its history, then in a way it's quite a miracle how long our restraints have lasted. It's quite a miracle that we have managed to put respect for others, compassion for others, including other species, on our agendas again and again and again, in spite of the worst periods of brutal history. And to me, that's a miracle, that for thousands of years we have learned to remember. And for me, the value of that history is to see today as a passing phase of madness, where just at the time where India is coming into its own, in terms of pluralistic civilization, having both a very ancient tradition and the ability to participate in the contemporary world, the best software producers, that we could make it all hang together in a very beautiful and harmonious way. That's precisely the time where we are losing confidence. and grabbing for the absolute throwaway trash of other cultures, including their shallow consumerist materialism. And this hit me really dramatically when I went to see our stall, which we run on organic foods at Dilli Haat. There was this blaring rock music. And here, this little niche meant for the crafts of this country was also being invaded by the worst kind of cultural production that has become a globalized culture.
So what are the elements of change? Do we sort of begin to work with human nature, the values that we were talking about, that you were referring to? Do we look at institutions and structures? How can we begin to impact institutions and structures unless we also work with changing our own individual needs of consuming less, of wanting less in some ways? The chicken and the egg, how does it unfold for you?
I think it's never either or, thank goodness. Because if it was either or, we would never have any solution to the kinds of problems that have been unleashed on the world. If it only depended on individual correction, individual improvement, individual nurturance of human nature, to not let it be identified only with greed and predation, but with sustaining others, looking after others and oneself, and looking after those. And I think that's what's most beautiful about the cultures of this land, that we recognize that you don't really have to bother about yourself, that if you deeply care about everything around you, you automatically get looked after in any case. If you look after your earthworms in your soil and the birds that control your pests in your field, they will do the rest for you.
But it's not something that we confront, experience, or sort of sensitize ourselves to in our immediate experience. Sort of philosophically in a larger worldview. What you say is entirely correct, and I think most people would applaud that. And it seems that most of the initiatives that people take are against institutions and structures. Are we seeing enough work on the individual and ourselves?
I agree with you that in a way, even, in a way, the dominant system has focused on changing human nature through institutional structures. I really believe that things like the free trade treaties of the World Trade Organization are basically a moral statement about we are basically greedy and you should be rewarded for being greedy. It is more than a trade phenomena. It is more than an economic phenomena. It is a moral phenomena. And in a way, economic institutions are writing contemporary morality. But the sad thing is that movements, citizens groups also fall into the same trap. And they try and change the human experience and the human enterprise by exclusively focusing on the institutions that are degrading our existence, our lives, our conditions. And I think we need to really take a step in both directions. And I feel purely institutional transformation without a deep living of the values that you think are the more desirable values for all humans, and having change at that level within your little institutions, your family, your community, that we can't really make a dent at all.
In your own life and striving, what have been the struggles perhaps in trying to reconcile these two, these impulses in a way? You went to university in Canada, you trained as a physicist, and you have slowly and gradually evolved into one of the outstanding spokespersons, activists in this genre of counter-development, sustainable development, alternative development, all sort of the larger words that come into it. But surely this must have in some ways paralleled a personal engaging with these issues as they affected you. Was there a turning point?
Many turning points. I don't think one can come so far in terms of what one imagined one would be doing. I was laughing, this morning because our main room in the office is full of rajma and chawal. And I was saying, I had thought I would look at quanta all my life. And here because I am looking...
Your PhD thesis was in the area of quantum theory. Yes.
And to me it was, it's quantum theory because I'm not interested in chawal and dal and roti. I don't want to be a typical housewife cooking for a family that takes you for granted. That wasn't my sense of what I wanted to be. And yet I've come full circle and I'm preoccupied with issues of food. and issues of feeding in healthy ways and growing food in healthy ways. I think there are a number of turning points in my life. The most dramatic, of course, is the Chipko movement, which taught me that one could live intellectually without being an academic, which taught me that you could know a lot without ever having been to school. Because I learned all my ecology lessons from the women of the Garhwal villages through the Chipko movement. But it changed my life because I could have the courage to give up university and not feel somehow that I was no more a thinking person. I was forced to create new situations where one could apply one's mind in innovative and creative ways to respond to the challenges around. The second major shift for me was really interacting with the biggest corporations of the world in '87, where they laid out their plan of patenting all life, of using genetic engineering to make sure they monopolize production, so that if they could prove to the world that only genetic engineering could feed the people, then only they would be controlling food production.
I was also looking at the internal struggles, perhaps, our growth or evolution into sort of balanced human beings in harmony with nature and aspiration and striving, go through sort of struggles where.
Absolutely.
So, what were your struggles? What did you find difficult to give up?
Well, I found it very difficult to balance social commitments for a larger caring with personal commitments for the fact that I was a mother. I was bringing up a child. I was bringing up a child under very difficult circumstances because very soon after he was born, my ex-husband basically decided to part ways. So I had to bring up my child with my father's help. It's a tremendous support because after all he'd brought us up, I think, very well. So it was a very, very wonderful support. But to constantly know that you've chosen a life that is larger than your personal life and your personal family, and yet you could never use that as a justification for neglecting your primary responsibilities. And that has constantly been a balancing act. You always, every moment, have to make choices. And I've tried my best to not make them heavily and not create burdens for others, but it is at every point a struggle within, at every point, even today.
You mentioned this sort of rajma and chawal in your living room, as it were, and I think you should explain that this is not merely rajma and chawal for your kitchen, but as an extension of the work that you do with Navdanya and the foundation and the work that you do in Dehradun. What are the goals of and what is the mission of Navdanya?
Well, Navdanya is basically, if to put it in a capsule, is my little charkha for the slavery of our times. Because the slavery of our times is taking place around life sciences corporations controlling all life. And these many years of being an ecologist and environmentalist, caring for life has really become my pulse. It's become what makes me tick. And to see precisely that which gives humans freedom, being enslaved through patents, manipulation, global control, is what created for me the in a drive to say you've got to do something. And I thought of Gandhi, and I said, when we were enslaved as an empire, Gandhi pulled out the charkha and started to spin. And what's the charkha of today? And I thought of the seed and started Navdanya. I could have called it the Program to Conserve Genetic Resources, but it wouldn't have resonated. It would not have meant anything. You say Navdanya in a village in India, everyone knows. It's about diversity, it's about food, it's about grain. Basically, for 10 years now, we've been saving seed, spreading organic farming so that the soil is not poisoned, humans are not poisoned, and farmers are not indebted and pushed to suicide. And for us, it's not just a project, and we are not just an NGO. For us, it's literally creating spaces for survival for millions of species and millions of people in this country in very modest ways. But I think if you do the right thing, even in small ways, it spreads very far.
So what is the reach and the scale of the program? How many people do you work with? And what are sort of some of the program elements, the initiatives that you...
Yeah. We have movements with farmers and we have movements with consumers. Our base is the farmers, and more than about 3,000 farmers now are using native seeds, conserving diversity, ensuring they use no chemicals when they grow food, and in the process actually increasing their incomes threefold. The reach of it now is that we've also got about 500 consumers in different parts of the country. We look after Delhi, but we have partners in Madras and we have partners in Calcutta who also have the programs feeding into local markets. Part of what Navdanya is trying to do is ensure that we have good food. You know, it's about conserving biodiversity, but it's also about saving farmers. But it's about saving good food for consumers, because we are reaching the stage where food is being treated like an automobile. That you can take one part from here and one part from there and mix it all together, and as long as at the end of it your calcium, iron, etc. works out the right combination, you're good. But you know, they tried that with the cattle feed, and they created the mad cow disease, because it is not that kind of reductionist chemical equivalence that makes for nourishment. And the mad cow disease is the lesson that tells us you cannot play around with our food, because it is really the source of life. And we have to give it the kind of respect we give life. To me, it's become absolutely the centerpiece of the economic enterprise. And the fascinating thing is actually it's also the centerpiece of the global trade enterprise, because their highest returns from investing in food, they're the most profitable companies are the food companies. So it's a wonderful little struggle between millions of species, millions of small farmers and 4 or 5 corporations. And Navdanya is doing its little bit to lean towards other species and the marginalized communities.
You mentioned your work with the Chipko movement, and was that sort of the first seeds of your interest in ecofeminism, and your looking at the issues of gender and environment?
Not really. I mean, in a sense, my own personal evolution has been an ecofeminist evolution. I've grown up in the mountains, I've grown up in the forests, I've grown up on farms. I've grown up in a feminist family. My father and mother were practicing feminists. They might not have had that label in their days, but you know, my father stitched all our frocks when we were children.
So what is a feminist?
To me, a feminist is a person, a man or a woman, who does not take for granted that men are born with the right to treat women in violent ways and as a secondary sex. It's basically a philosophy based on recognition that men and women are human beings, slight differences here and there, but not inequality as an intrinsic characteristic. So my own personal trajectory has been ecofeminism, but thinking about it as a social phenomena, definitely it was Chipko.
And how does this notion of feminism translate to ecofeminism?
Well, what hit me about participating in those days in the Chipko movement were, you know, these Garhwal peasants, strong, tough women, coming out, leading an environmental campaign and having insights much deeper than the top environmentalists who were writing at that time. This was the period of Stockholm, the first ever meeting on the environment. And yet the few things that I would learn in those villages would be so much more valuable than the 30 books one could read at that time. And Chipko and other movements very quickly started to show up that women were leading environmental campaigns on the ground, and it was connected to 2 phenomena. The first was because of the division of labor coming out of patriarchal organizing of society, women have been left to look after the things that matter in life, because men have gone on to grab what seems to be the achievement of wars, money making, everything else that seems to count but is actually not so central to living. And because women have been left to sustain life, they obviously also know when life is not being sustained, and therefore they respond. It's not that they're biologically better at it, it's just that they've been left to cope with it. And the philosophy of it is of course connected to the fact that the same thinking that creates a development enterprise that thinks that nature is nothing. You know, till you build a dam, you're not storing water, that in the catchments of our forests are the best dams and our best storage systems. That till you put urea, you don't have soil fertility. That idea that nature is empty and development puts things in is the same worldview that imagine that women are the secondary sex because they look after what has been defined in that paradigm as a secondary activity of sustaining life.
Do you have the faith that that Western capital, which is able to so effectively thus far exploit the natural capital of developing societies and developing countries, that in this sort of this tug-of-war, this tussle between these two elements, that in fact the capital of nature, the capital of humanity, of developing communities, in fact has a chance before it's too late?
I don't know about the being too late, because what time scale do you count it at? If you count it on a cosmic time scale, there's never a too late.
Before the extinction of the human species, perhaps.
I think the human species will make life very difficult for itself for a while. And I think this idea that somehow capital's capital is the only real capital, and nature's capital doesn't matter, cultural capital, human capital doesn't matter, that thinking is going to generate so much cost. And it'll never be able to connect those phenomena to itself, which is, the costs are bad enough. But the problem is, this kind of reductionist fragmented thinking also shuts your thinking off from seeing the connections and saying, yes, as you globalize more and more, you become more and more insensitive to what happens in Orissa. So it takes you 8 days to wake up to disasters in your backyard because you're so much more busy seeing how stock markets are going up and down on Wall Street, and your entire system has geared up to respond to that global market phenomena and not to the human and natural phenomena in your own backyard. But I have a very deep, I'm a very political being on the one hand, but behind it, I think what gives me long-term energy is a very deep faith in the basic forces of creation. That there is a creative cosmos out there that's so much bigger than anything we do as human beings, as commercial actors, as politicians. And ultimately, and in a way, the Orissa cyclone is such a reminder that we can build the grandest of projects, and it takes one little wind to slap it all down. And to me, the humility that creates also forces a recognition that we do our bit, but how the eventual resolution of all these contending forces in human society will work out is in a way beyond our hands. And all we can do is trust the larger phenomena.
Vandana Shiva, thank you very much. It's been a great privilege.